Thank you very much, Mr. Bajaj, for a very comprehensive presentation. I must admit that you provided a very strong leadership as a chairman of the Power Group in organizing this summit. You invested your personal efforts and time along with all of us. And the result is that we have full hall present here. As I said, every year we organize this event. This year, a lot of thought went in deciding the theme of the seminar and the topics to be deliberated. Mr. Bajaj and I, our association goes back to last 35, 40 years when he joined BHEL, I was there. And since then, we have been very close to each other. Thank you, Mr. Bajaj, for giving the leadership in organizing this summit. I have now the privilege of inviting the Managing Director of our knowledge partner, Mr. Raghuttama Rao. We have been working with ICRA Management Consultancy Service for the last 4 or 5 years. I must admit that our association has been very, very honorable, very, very fruitful. I must admit that Mr. Rao takes personal interest in preparing the theme paper for the theme which we generally jointly decide for this Power Summit. We are honored with his presence. He has always made it a point that he will attend the inaugural session of our each Power Summit. May I now invite Mr. Raghuttama Rao to give presentation on the theme. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bambani. Good morning to all of you. Our chief guest, Mr. Kant, Mr. Dubey, Dr. Sharma, our colleagues from IEF, industry captains, ladies and gentlemen. You know, as we put together this theme paper for the year, and the topic we really chose is, how does power sector contribute to growing GDP? There are several paradoxes that we see. I think some of the speakers have spoken about it. Is the power sector in crisis, or is it looking at a rosy future? Is it both? Can the both coexist together? Therefore, what should actually industry stance be? What should policymakers do? What should the narrative be rich in? That's really the 3 or 4 themes that I want to touch in the next 10 minutes or so. We have put a lot of material and data in the theme paper. I'm going to kind of touch upon the salient features here. My talk is going to be in 3 clusters of themes. What is the India growth story? We know it very well. But what is the role of power really in this? Power is never consumed for its own sake. We all understand. Nobody eats electrons. Nobody does anything with electrons. That's what we all supply. All this noise and investment is all about that. But we have to do it well, because the outcome of that, including what you see around here, the sound bites that you're hearing, what you're reading from, the light, air conditioning, comforts, everything is what? It's a derived demand in its fullest sense. Now, when we look at the India growth story, I see 3 things. We grew at 6% in the first 5 years of the decade, had a boom, 9-10%, come back a little bit. Now we're kind of planning to grow at a much higher rate, over the next, let's say over the next decade or 2. And that is a harder task today than it's probably ever been, because we are looking at a world which is in chaos, in the economic sense, in geopolitical terms, and in every sense of the word. It's more volatile, it's more uncertain. Clearly, large blocks are in recession. Now, how do we grow out of this? Okay, so we have a large domestic story, fair point. India is a large economy today. I mean, it's probably the largest growing large economy of the world. It's the fastest growing large economy of the world. And that is what our policy makers are seeking to push and leverage on going forward. Now, there are many growth drivers. Now, why am I touching upon this well-known facts? Because the need for what the power sector has to deliver will come from here. Urbanization will be a big theme going forward. Today, 55% of our value add comes from cities with about 30% of our population. In the next 10 years, it's likely to become 75%. Not to say that rural is getting marginalized, but the growth engine, the pocket dynamo is here. About 70 cities will be where bulk of growth will get created. Our demographic dividend we talk about. Now, what is the point of demographic dividend and relevance for the power sector, other than looking at for talent? I think the issue is, ours is a very aspirational country. Now, whether we want it or not, whether government policies support it or not, the need, the aspiration to grow, own, consume will rise in the next 3 decades like never before. We already see it in many parts. So whether our middle class, which is aspirant, getting more affluent, becomes more the bulge of our economy as it happens towards the middle class and the affluent society, whether it's the consumption earning class, which kind of outnumbers every other segment, I think it will add to demands of the electricity sector in a very positive sense. We also have government pushing in a very relentless manner, and rightfully, that's the way it should be. So we have the GST that's coming in, we have Make in India, we have Skill India, we have missions to vitalize the water sector, agriculture, all of which touch the electricity sector in some way, in fact, substantively. So therefore, the power sector has a very indirect, a hidden and an invisible role to play in the way our economy will consume and grow in the next 3 decades. What's a snapshot of our power sector? The graphic on the right top side, right? That shows that demand and supply have converged, apparently. The peak demand and availability of capacity has also converged. The right-hand graphic on the top shows that the energy deficit and the peak deficit have almost become zero. I mean, let's say minus 2% or thereabouts. So what are we talking about? Are we saying that the story is good? There's enough power to go? No, this is the paradox, one of the several paradoxes that you see. So what has really happened, when you look at shortages and capacity shortages of 10% in the last 4-5 years to coming down to near zero or surplus, what has really happened is capacity has caught up. We have had a huge incremental capacity that's come up in the last 5-10 years. And we have more capacity in the pipeline that's kind of threatening to get commissioned. Good story, in one sense of the word. But clearly the dynamics on the ground for generators and for the power sector is changing. Today you have power which is available in exchange as 3-4% maybe, but at 2 rupees, even almost below variable cost. That's where it's getting consumed. So you have a different dynamics of the power sector. And in the story of a relentless demand and aspirational class that's rising up, you have this question of who will consume my power? You're talking of stranded capacity. The second point here in the bottom part is look at our generation capacity mix. 60% will tend to be power, but you have renewable power which is 14-15%. The next 2 decades or 15 years, you'll have 40% of our capacity getting to be, must-run power plants, solar or wind. What happens then? What happens with the coal and thermal power? Will they start to become supporting, generation capacity? I mean, again, a very paradoxical situation. So really you're talking of a situation where renewable energy starts becoming competitive, in cost terms, even in terms of incremental capacity creation with thermal capacity. You're going to have the entire power sector in terms of transmission, in terms of distribution, in terms of consumption, in terms of financial investors looking at this sector very differently from how they've been looking at it in the last 2 decades and more. Now, the government has done a lot of initiatives. I'm not going to go through that. I'm sure Mr. Kant will probably touch upon that. There are clearly 10 points here in the last 2 years which really stand out. The Uday scheme, it's a very good beginning. It's a very bold beginning. It's a very expensive exercise, maybe required. But the question that begs is this sustainable? So you have rural electrification. You have a whole host of reforms in the coal sector. Hopefully, it'll become a 1 billion industry in the next few years. Demand side initiatives, we have the largest scheme going out in the world. I mean, roughly 10% of our current consumption will actually get saved if our DSM measures go through. I mean, so we are talking of very positive things on the demand side, but which have huge implications for generators. So, these are issues that will need to get debated as we go on. What are we talking of? I mean, I looked at the statement that the Power Ministry put out. In fact, the Power Minister himself put this out. We have $1 trillion investment in the next 15 years. In fact, ADB was even more bullish about it. The figure that ADB, Asian Development Bank, had put out for India in terms of requirement across fresh capacities, the kind of technological measures that need to be brought into the power sector to absorb a varying mix of generation, weeding out inefficient generation. We have, unfortunately, a lot of suboptimal, bad technology, which is getting stranded, or which will get stranded as demanding consumers come to the fore. We'll have to have overhauling of our wires in many ways, new systems to come in. So $1 trillion investment over 15 years does not look out of whack. But the question that really needs to be asked is, are our financial investors ready? Equity investors, debt investors are fighting shy of the power sector today. Once bitten, twice shy. That is the story today. If you look at from a sustainability point of view, we've signed the Paris Accord. What does that mean to us? It has to be of a different kind of technologies. Affordability of power. Mr. Bajaj talked about it, and I'll talk a little bit about it. And viability. At the end of it all, today the power sector is not viable. At the end of it all, all the profits made by generation or transmission sectors, they have to be seen by adding even the distribution sector. What is the sector looking like? The sector does not make money. Forget return on equity. It doesn't cover costs. So therefore, with that situation, that is the turnaround that needs to happen. So there are 4 challenges that come by. There are many more, but I'm trying to put it here. I mean, what is the access to electricity? Okay, the minister had put out a figure of, we have 70%, 80%, connections. But what is the number of households that have access to electricity? Unfortunately, 1/3 households are yet to get reliable power. That is the situation on the ground now. Maybe a little more in terms of connections have happened. Quality and reliability of supply, I think we have some way to go. Lots of places don't get 24/7 power. Competitive rates, I'll show some data about competitive power, and we have Mr. Kant here, who is championing Make in India. And I think the figures here will talk a little bit about what the compulsions on our industry will be. And the environmental footprint, which will actually start to bite, because the commitments are serious. How do you go down to 2005 levels of emissions across energy chain, including electricity? How do you do that? And what are the compulsions of that? So in terms of per capita consumption, we are very low. All right, some of these countries are cold countries, so they probably need heat electricity and oil for heat. But even if you discount that, we are way behind. Even China is 4 times. If we want to become a powerhouse like China and their GDP is 4 times, we need to catch up. Only 2/3 of our households have electricity in terms of what we experience. So we have a long way to catch up, meaning there's more demand likely to come. More investments which are uneconomical that have to be crossed. That is the implication here. In terms of reliability of supply, 24 hours, this is the statistics. There are very few states which actually give 24-hour supply. Very few. And as far as the agriculture sector, which is our consumers, obviously they don't pay, you don't get enough subsidy in time. Why should any commercial entity, even if it's a state-owned entity, how can they afford to give it? So 24/7 is a myth, and it will remain a myth until some of the governing conditions change around it. And look at the affordability of electricity supply. See, this is where we need to look at. You have several industries where electricity is 1/3 to 20% of the cost of production. Now, when you have, and these are the countries we compete with in the world. We have put out the cost of industrial tariff. India is really way out there. In fact, when we wrote the automation plan, we helped the government write the automation plan, which we just finished a couple of months back. There, the power sector, power cost is not significant for the auto and automotive components. It's actually a very small component. But in terms of where, and India has great potential, in manufacturing. It's probably the number 1 industry, even ahead of textiles. But there, the cost of power and cost of logistics starts to become a barrier in terms of getting investments on the ground. Even if you look at services like banking and financial services or KP or any of these, power cost is negligible. It's not something that people sweat about, but it is an essential input into that activity. Reliable, assured power. And that becomes a barrier to put that investment in India or put it in Manila or put it elsewhere which competes for it. So therefore, power cost is not just in terms of absolute cost and dollars or rupees, but it's also a question of, is it available at tap? That's the issue in terms of competitiveness. And I think the power industry needs to have this dialogue with government to see how it can improve. I will move on the environment issue talked. Short point is renewable energy will become 40% in terms of capacity in the next 15 years. Given that their PLF or capacity utilization is 1/3 of thermal, so you will have a 15% or 20% energy mix. More than that is very hard for the grid to handle. But those are the investments that need to come in. The four things we think that our theme paper identifies, Mr. Bajaj has spoken on one of these, tariff rationalization. Today, when you look at the data, from a cost of supply point of view and the tariffs charged, the industrial and commercial tariffs are way out, unsustainable. We are already unaffordable in terms of competitiveness. So clearly, therefore, tariffs have to get rationalized. See, the key point is, why do we want to use state electricity utilities, DISCOMs, as instruments of public policy? Electricity is a commercial business. There are funders available in India. The technology is available in India. There are capable entrepreneurs to put it up. There are investors willing to pay. And I think with technologies of direct benefit transfer, which is again alluded to earlier, if those kind of technologies and instruments available, it's time that government of India stops using, or state governments stop using state DISCOMs as a means of cross subsidy and confusing the viability of the sector completely. Getting competition in retail supply. The heart of the Electricity Act, which was done about 10, 12, 13 years back, was competition. How do you get competition in this sector? And I think open access even at the wholesale is thereabouts, is kind of there, not there. The retail sector, there are legislative issues. Yes, it's a more difficult game to play. But eventually, it will have to happen. You have to get these efficiencies in. We have taken very hard decisions in the last few weeks. We can see this government has shown the propensity to make hard bites, even if they are politically inconvenient or economically not very clear. I think this last bit reform in the electricity sector is similar, has to get done. If we want to make the sector viable, you want to get in the benefits of competition, you want to unlock the benefits of at a retail level, you have to go the mile, you have to go the entire distance in making this sector open. How do you get renewable energy on the ground? 175 megawatts, good policy measures, good technology available, but until you have regulators who can bite, there have been, if you look at our regulatory spectrum in power, it's not like banking or telecom, where you have one regulator for the country. It's fragmented. So your capacities are different, your remit is different, your approach is different, the independence they have and the exercise is very different. And then that becomes difficult when you have a national level industry. So if you have an RPO, how do you exercise that RPO? You can't have players getting away by violating regulation. It's unthinkable in the financial sector. It's unthinkable in the telecom sector. Why does it happen in the power sector? Why do you have outages and still get away with it? So these kind of regulatory teeth need to be done if you want to get renewable energy to the capacity that we are talking of in the next 10, 15 years. And lastly, I think what we are saying is there are natural monopolies that policy making will have to recognize in the power sector. The bottom graphic shows the losses of the DISCOMs. It's coming down, maybe after the Uday it will come down, but as we said, we have done cosmetics, so we have put Band-Aid when surgery is required. So that's going to carry you some far, make you feel good, but it doesn't solve the problem. There are operational, can we say, imperatives for the state DISCOMs, but we really need to see how the story will play out. Essentially, recognize that electricity is a commercial business that can be managed by the private sector with tight, good, hard regulation. Make that paradigm change in regulation, make that paradigm change in the way the sector operates, make the paradigm change in how government wants to give subsidies if it should, in a manner that doesn't, mess with the industry's financials and cash flows. I think financial markets will recognize that. In the absence of these reforms going forward, I think, we are condemned to repeating history, rather than learning from them and moving on here. So therefore, government should move towards independent corporate ownership and of generation, transmission and trading, distribution, the entire value chain, and look at natural monopolies where they ought to be, maybe own them, maybe try, oversee them more clearly, and then ensure that this industry finds its true potential. Thank you very much.